1850s, that's the beginning of our problem.
We have lost the taste of wheat, and we need to get it back.
But here's where it gets really scary, because I'm talking about additives we put into animal feed. Well, we're putting these same stuff into human feed.
It kind of sounds like we're creating CAFOs for ourselves.
They're paid 9 cents a pound for the wheat. That's criminal.
We're making whole grain bread in what I call a white flour industrial complex.
But grains are what feed us. And in our culture, taking control of wheat is the change agent.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm Linley Dixon, co-director of the Real Organic Project. We're a grassroots, farmer-led movement with an add-on organic food label to distinguish organic crops grown in healthy soils and livestock raised on well-managed pasture, all without synthetic fertilizers and toxic chemicals. Today's episode is a new approach for us. Instead of our usual one-on-one interview format, you'll be hearing from several voices, including food systems author Michael Pollan, chef Dan Barber, farmer Bob Quinn, author Mark StCyr, and restaurateur and community organizer Bob Klein. Together, these guests tell a fascinating story about bread. What is it? What it has been, and what it could be. Now, not only does bread have the potential to transform people and land nutritionally, but it can empower communities, and in the past it has built healthy civilizations. We hope that you enjoy it and that you'll join us next week when we'll be airing our conversation with Eli Pipkin, the talented baker at the restaurant Blue Hill at Stone Barns. Eli walks us step by step through how to make a really great loaf of bread. Enjoy.
Let me ask you then about bread. I have two more questions.
I have to bring Eli out here, yeah.
I know. I want to talk to Eli, but okay, your bread is astonishingly good. And my wife always says, if she knows I'm coming, make sure you bring back some bread.
We have to get you some, yeah.
So, but here's my question. I asked you before, but I still didn't get a good enough answer. It doesn't answer. Your bread is so good. And
hey, Eli, you're going to come out here. He wants to interview you in 5 minutes. Okay. Is that good? All right, yeah.
So it's so good. It's not just that Eli is an awesome baker, which he is. There's all that technique
Craft,
that goes into it, but there's also the sourcing of the wheat, and there's also the milling of the wheat. Yeah. All of this stuff goes into making. I make good bread. It's not as good as the bread here. Yeah. It's not. So, and I'm working on it. I'll get there. But
you will.
Here's my question. Why wouldn't, I don't mean to pick on Whole Foods, but I'll just pick them as a place that has an obvious audience that would care and be willing to pay a premium for your bread. If it was available in every Whole Foods, it would be a major leader for them. People would go, oh my God. You yourself said, when I said, what's the gateway food that would take us to being able to taste again? Because we're jaded by too many Doritos. We can't actually even tell whether that's a good blueberry.
Right.
We're corrupted. Our taste is, which is such a precious sense.
Yeah.
So you said, I said, what would the gateway food be? You said bread.
Did I say that? Good
you said that.
Yeah.
You said.
I think I said that partly because the two things. One is it's so democratizable. One, I mean, what else? It built Western civilization. It should, a slice of bread in every person's mouth that's truly nutritious as possible. But the other is that we've, of all the things we've lost the taste of, more than anything, it's wheat. Yeah. People don't even understand that wheat has taste, that there is a taste. We've lost the taste of wheat, which is what a farmer once said to me, and it's always stuck with me. It's so true. Because we've mummified it, we've commoditized it and then mummified it, and it's white flour. It's meant to have no flavor. It's simple like a salad. A romaine, an iceberg is mummified to the extent that it's a vector for fat and and salt, and fat dressing, a ranch dressing. Even
the whole wheat. If you go get whole wheat flour in the store, it's not whole wheat.
Right.
They've taken out the brand.
They've taken out the germ, and they've taken out a lot of the brand too. And people say whole wheat bread, and they throw that around, and it's usually 20%, brand, which is nothing, obviously. And brand's where the flavor is. But you have to be able to deal with it, and you have to have the right varieties. I'll tell you something. I think genetics with wheat is very important because we've been breeding wheat to screen it off, meaning we've been breeding wheat for white flour.
Yeah.
And by that I mean we've been breeding wheat that has a hard exterior, a hard brand. We want hard brands because hard brands crack easier in the milling process and give you white flour faster, cleaner. That's very expensive for the, all the powers in the miller, always has been. But you create wheat varieties that crack easily, that give you the endosperm. That's a huge money difference for the millers. And that hard wheat is very unpalatable. The softer spring wheats, dark wheats, the softer brands, which is where the heirlooms come. Einkorn is a good example, or Emmers. Those are much softer, but that's before we were selecting for whole, for white flour. We were whole grains. We were still trying to screen it off. I just had a talk with all my cooks and the waiters. I was like, stop for the diners to come in here and say, I want to have bread. I'm so happy to finally have bread that my great grandparents used to have. It's like, your grandparents didn't have this? Your grandparents were trying to make white flour too. Your great grandparents were, and you know what? We're trying to make white flour since Roman time. Everyone's been screening off with bed sheets. Since the beginning of time, we have chased the energy dense the sweet energy dense white flour.
Morning.
Good morning. Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast, and I am very pleased to be talking with Bob Klein this morning. Bob is co-owner with his wife Maggie of Oliveto in Oakland, California, and he also has a brainchild called Community Grains. Tell me a little bit about Community Grains. What's your vision for that?
Creating a thriving alternative grain system in scale. Being able to go to the grocery store and buy bread that isn't garbage, that actually has nutrients and tastes great, and not spend $15 for it.
Yeah.
And grain is interesting in that it's scalable. It's hard to scale tomatoes in a way. I mean, you can scale tomatoes, but you don't want those tomatoes.
Yeah.
But grain is astonishingly nutritious. Like people don't understand how good it is, but it's like the most important food there is. The first industrial food is wheat. 1850s. That's the beginning of our problem, and so it was much cheaper. It had great shelf life, and you could put train loads. I'll go to to a big roller mill. There are roller mills that do 4 million pounds a day of flour. Train truckloads. They're paid 9 cents a pound for the wheat. That's criminal. End of story. Like, okay, a crime has been committed. So if you have a farmer who grows good wheat on good soil, and he sends a 40,000 pound truckload of good wheat to the grain elevator, and then they fumigate it, and then they send it to the mill, and the mill takes out 25% of the weight, so now it's 30,000 pounds of endosperm, of starch, very little food value, and the 25% goes off to a feedlot, or it feeds chickens, or they can make more money in that way. Some of it goes to vitamins, to vitamin E. And so now you got 30,000 pounds of nothing, and then it goes to the bread factory, and the wheat is high protein. Well, it's probably not high protein because it's good wheat. Bad wheat is usually high protein because the soil's been destroyed by the protein. So I'm going to change where the farm came from. So now you've got bad wheat going in, you lose 30%, you lose 25% of it. Now you have nothing, but it's high protein because it's got a lot of, it's been nitrogen to death. And then you go to the factory, and then they can put it in a bag within 3 hours. And then we're like outraged that they're using plastic bags. So this is Michael Pollan. You all know Michael Pollan. He's just a wonderful journalist and a really smart and someone for me who continually opens up new ideas and new windows. And he's got, I think, some pretty interesting ideas that are coming up.
I thought I would tell a little bit about my own journey and what brought me to this community of people who are semi-obsessed with whole grains and with bread in general. My last book, Cooked, was the story of the four great transformations that we call cooking, one of which is baking. And as part of that, I embarked on a quest to make a great loaf of bread. Probably a failed quest, but that was the quest. And I started, like most people do, with white bread, because that's most bread in our culture, and it's easier to do. And I got okay at it, but I've also written a lot about nutrition, and I knew pretty well that white flour, although it's incredibly attractive to us for many, many reasons, and it fits industry and the way mechanization and capitalism work, it's not ideal. One of the subtexts of this book is that for most of human history, and I'm going back 2 million years, most of the things innovations that have happened under the umbrella of food processing, beginning with putting fire to food, continuing with cooking in pots with liquids, all the various fermented foods, all these incredible inventions of our species have contributed to our health, have tended to make food more nutritious, have tended to make it more interesting and more flavorful, and have tended, also often to increase its shelf life. And these have been very positive. So food processing, a word that we kind of put negative connotations on for most of history, has been a very good thing for us. And it counts for a lot of our success as a species, because most animals don't cook and don't know how to process their food to make it more nutritious the way we do. There's a couple exceptions, like squirrels who bury seeds to ferment them a little bit. So I was really curious as to determine the turning point when food processing went bad. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized it was the invention of the roller mill in the 1870s and 1880s. The roller mill is what gave us really white flour. Before that, you could get whitish flour. It tended to be a little yellowish because basically you were grinding it on a stone mill, and then you were sifting it as finely as you could, and you got rid of lots of the bran, but you couldn't quite get rid of that smushed germ, and which turned out was keeping people healthy to a very large extent. But we wanted flour to be whiter. There were a lot of reasons for that. One is prestige. White flour, like white rice, had always had this kind of prestige. It showed you had money because it took money to sift it, and also because we are hardwired to like sugar, sweetness. And the whiter the flour, the quicker the hit of sugar you get the moment it hits your tongue. So it's no wonder that it was a goal, and it was achieved with these mills that for the first time made it possible to break off the bran and the germ immediately and leave that starchy white endosperm as basically all you were going to eat, which is mostly starch, and it has some protein as well. As soon as this innovation hits, many interesting things happen. One is you have the consolidation of the milling industry, because now that you're down to the white starch, you don't have the germ that's going to cause rancidity. So suddenly flour can last indefinitely, which means you don't need a little mill in every town. And a handful of large companies can mill all your flour, which is what we now have. And so you have the consolidation of milling. And you also have suddenly a whole lot of health problems. You have to remember how central bread was to most of European history. It represented about 50% of the calories in the diet in Europe for hundreds of years. So if you fundamentally changed its nutritional quality, which we did, no wonder that we had rising rates of chronic diseases. We had nutrient deficiencies, vitamin deficiencies. and people were getting sick on this new bread. Eventually, we figured out part of the problem, which was that we had taken out important nutrients. And so beginning early in the last century, we started fortifying bread. And this was kind of the classic capitalist fix. You know, once you've screwed up a food, you don't go back and retrace your steps and try to get it right. You create a new business that makes money off of the problems created by the last business.
I'm talking today with Mark StCyr. Mark, welcome. Welcome to my home. Welcome to this podcast.
Nice to do it in person.
I will say for our audience that I think that you are, one of the really important teachers of our time about food and about the food we eat, what's wrong, what's right, and we'll see about where to go from here. So we go back to those initial depletion of the raw ingredients being significant in all this. I think that depletion drives the flavor industry as part of what fuels it. It becomes self-propelling after a while. It doesn't care. We're in a system where people are constantly getting the latest flavor of Doritos and the latest Powerade and the latest, version. It seems like what you're describing has set it off and is continuing to fuel it, but it seems like a kind of a crazy machine that is running amok.
Yeah, it is. It's sort of a self-fueling thing. Although not in certain cultures.
Okay, so that's a question. Is this about culture?
I mean, it's difficult to say. Everyone says, oh, it sounds like that's a culture thing. Well, if it is a culture thing, then all we should be doing is talking about culture. I think it goes deeper than that. I got really interested in this question of Italy, and I wanted to know what is it that's different about Italy versus us. And I started to look back in the history books, and what I found actually surprised me, because I found out that there was a time in Italy, northern Italy in particular, when it wasn't actually different from us, it was actually the same. This is going back a little more than a century. They had an epidemic of something called pellagra, which is an Italian word in a local dialect. It means rough skin. And it was this mysterious disease. It was one of the first people to notice it was the famous German writer Goethe. He noticed it when he was doing this kind of tour of Italy. And it would start in the spring, and it would be like these strange skin scales. And then it might go away, but it would come back the next spring, and it might be worse. And it would get worse and worse. People would get diarrhea. They'd get delirium. They attacked children. They did all sorts of bizarre things, and eventually it would lead to death. Well, pellagra mysteriously crossed the pond and showed up, I think it was in Georgia first, and it started to spread across the South. And the South became the pellagra belt. And it was very much like the obesity epidemic insofar as it was an epidemic, and it had to do, and no one knew what was causing it. There was all sorts of strange theories. Sometimes they thought it had to do with moisture. They said if you lived too close to a river or too far from a river, you could get pellagra, but if you lived just the right distance, you didn't. For some reason, divorced men would get pellagra, but married men didn't. Jews didn't seem to get pellagra. Some people said it was mosquitoes. Some people said it was sandflies. There was 100 different theories. Nobody knew what it was until this guy, an epidemiologist named Joseph Goldberger, was sent down to a sanatorium. And they thought he was nuts because he said, don't touch a thing. He said, don't clean the rooms, don't do any more extra laundry. But he said, let's feed them differently. And he said, let's give the inmates things like peas and milk and cheese and maybe meat if they could afford it. And the pellagra went away. And that was one of the most important findings in what would become the science of nutrition, because they realized that there was some essential element in food that caused this disease. If this element wasn't there in the sufficient quantity, you got this strange disease. That element is what we now call niacin, vitamin B3. And that was the beginning of our comprehension of essential nutrients. So the discovery of niacin and the discovery of this pellagra-preventing diet really changed nutrition. But what's so interesting is when you look at how North America dealt with the pellagra problem and how Italy dealt with it. North America married cutting-edge science with public policy. We mandated the fortification of flour. We said, let's add, if people need niacin, let's add niacin. They also said, let's add these other B vitamins, riboflavin and thiamine. They also said, let's throw in some iron for good measure. It started with, I think it was white bread, but then it slowly expanded to things like pasta. And now it's in pretty much any flour product, even in corn flour. It's all enriched. Enriched is when it's enrichment and fortification are the same thing. They call it enrichment when the government says you got to do it. What's so funny is Italy didn't do that. The approach that Italy took, it's like they were still stuck in the Dark Ages. They said things like, well, poor people should raise rabbits because rabbits are, an economical form of meat, and we should have communal bread ovens, and maybe people with pellagra should drink wine. And you just think, like, are you guys idiots? Funnily enough, it actually wasn't bad advice because back then the wines weren't very well filtered. They had all sorts of yeast in them, and yeast is an amazing source of niacin. What's even more interesting is that it actually worked. Didn't work as quickly, but Italy literally ate its way out of a nutritional deficiency. Now here's where things get more interesting. Fast forward the clock 100 years. What was the pellagra belt has become the obesity belt, or it's become the diabetes belt. You look at Italy, and what was the pellagra belt is now northern Italy, arguably the most economically productive part of Europe, even more economically productive than the Rhine Valley. Northern Italy has got serious amounts of money. And I just don't want to create the sense it's a bunch of rich people. It's an incredibly functional, beautiful society. It's where they design their beautiful sports cars, where the fashion comes from. They really have lifestyle nailed down. Architecture is beautiful. The food's great. Northern Italy is an amazing place to live. And they have this wonderful relationship with food. Meanwhile, what the heck happened in the American South? You'd think that this exacting science of nutrition would have fixed the problem. And on the surface, it sort of looks like it made it worse. Now, what I find so interesting about this approach is the assumptions behind each one, because the American approach said, okay, there's something wrong with food, in that sometimes food doesn't have these nutrients that you need, and there's something wrong with humans, because we don't know what to eat. We'll eat this food that makes us sick. So let's step in and fix what's wrong with food. And that's what we did. Italy said, no, there's nothing wrong with food. The problem is people are too poor to afford food, so let's give poor people food. What's so interesting about the American approach is that this is the approach we kept on taking. Now we fortify breakfast cereals. You can get energy drinks from Starbucks that have twice the amount of riboflavin, I think it is, or niacin that you actually need. We've thought that the cold, precise hand of science can fix everything to do with food. If you look at things like plant-based meats, they call it the impossible burger, because there's this idea that we can break these bonds of nature and do something almost supernatural. And it doesn't work. Even the idea that you can flavor a Dorito to taste like taco, we never questioned it because we just thought flavor was this stupid thing that didn't make any sense in the first place. Whereas over in Italy, they say things like, well, you can't call plant-based milk because it's not milk, or plant-based meat is not meat. So, and we think they're kind of these, what's this funny traditional attitude. Their system works much better than ours because they have a reverence for food, the way it tastes and where it comes from, because they think taste really does matter. And it does matter.
Okay, so I am struck by something here. I'm curious what you think about it. The power of how you look at something. I mean, we're talking about two enormously different ways of responding to the same problem, which is a bunch of people who are eating a poor diet because they're economically disadvantaged. And in America, it was, let's add all of these inputs, which actually sounds a great deal like chemical agriculture to me. We have a problem, the land is not thriving, let's add chemical fertilizers, and then voila, we get big green plants, and voila, I think it leads to a great many problems. In northern Italy, they're taking the same problem, and let's figure out how we can change people's access to good food, which I think is more like saying, how can we build an organic system so that the land maintains its fertility by improving the cycling of nutrients and water, and that the outcome is we don't need the pesticides. We haven't created a whole secondary set of problems. Does that hold up for you?
Yeah, it does. I don't know if I thought of it specifically in those terms, but there is a knock-on effect that is, I think, directly like that, and that has to do with the effects of these vitamins they're adding to food. This is something I got interested in the Dorito effect because I talked about the work of Fred Provenza and how the work he would do with goats, where you could make them deficient in a needed nutrient. He did phosphorus, and then he'd pair that to a flavoring. So like something like coconut, so that when the goats became deficient in phosphorus, they would crave the flavor of coconut. So you pair this flavoring with a vitamin. What I also realized is it could work the other way around. If you start putting vitamins in things, does that start to mess things up? And I got curious about what are these, has there been a consequence of this dumping of vitamins into food that we haven't seen? I know it sounds nuts. I mean, we're into tinfoil hat territory here, because vitamins, I mean, like the word vital is part of vitamins. There's no calories in vitamins. How could there be anything wrong with vitamins? Vitamins are the nourishing elements of what make food nourishing to begin with. But there is a problem with it. And the reason we know is because we can look at how animal agriculture changed. And I knew this, I had suspected this for a long time, but I couldn't find the science. It wasn't until the algorithms in Google Scholar got good enough that I finally found the body of research. And it comes to us from pig farming. If you look at pig farming in the 1950s, they were doing all sorts of things to try and improve yield, because that's what the animal scientists have always been trying to do, is just get more bang for our buck, so to speak. And they were doing things like they were inbreeding pigs for generations to try and get these traits to grow bigger, faster. Most of it didn't work. But they also knew, as this science of nutrition came along, it started to change things. What they knew back then was that there was a rocket fuel feed for pigs. It was corn and soy. That if you gave them corn and soy, they would grow, they would just take off. But they also knew that's not all you could give them, because if that's all you gave them, the growth takes off, then it craters. And then they start to like lose their hair, they seem to get dizzy, they can't walk, they get terrible diarrhea, scours, and then they die. They were getting something like the pig version of pellagra or a different nutritional deficiency. They knew back then that you had to send the pigs out into pasture to balance the diet. They didn't know why, but everybody pastured pork back then, not because it was trendy, but because you had to, because you couldn't just feed pigs corn and soy. Then comes the B vitamins. And there's these amazing trials where they start to take this corn-soy diet and they start to just sprinkle in one B vitamin at a time. And all of a sudden we see, instead of cratering, the growth takes off and it keeps going. And this changed pig farming. They start to get levels of growth that were unimaginable. They called it optimal. And very quickly, the model of pig farming changed. There's this great document I found, I think it was put out by the University of Illinois in the late 1950s, basically telling farmers, this is what you do now. It said things like, pigs have a reasonable ability to naturally balance their diet, but we have a better science of it now. And they talked about optimal weight gain. So when we talk about CAFOs and confinement animal agriculture, whether it's feedlots or whether it's chicken houses or whether it's these facilities we've created for pigs, I don't even know what to call them. It's not a barn. I don't know what it is. They've got these like factories now in China. None of that would have been possible without the science of micronutrition. Vitamins is what made that possible. Because before that, you needed to send your chickens, you needed to give them green feed and table scraps or send them outside. Pigs had to be pastures, and cows had to have access to grass. You could give them some grain, but they needed grass. Vitamins changed everything. Without the revolution in our understanding of essential nutrients, we would not have confinement animal feeding. It wouldn't exist. So in that regard, it's very much like what you're talking about.
That's actually a really stunning thing. I don't think most people understand that. I think people think, well, we've got confinement livestock now. So, let's say lots of people think that they're not in love with that because the animals lead such a hard life there. But they think that this is the inevitable consequence of increasing efficiency. But it actually is not about efficiency in terms of the systems. Yes, you can make a very efficient system if you don't have to pay attention to a whole diet for the animal because you can just hit them with the vitamins.
Yeah, well, what's also interesting is that they have to feed restrict the seed stock, the animals that you use to get your eggs or your piglets or your calves, because they will get morbidly obese. So this is not really a sustainable diet. But here's where it gets really scary, because I'm talking about additives we put into animal feed. Well, we're putting these same stuff into human feed. If you look at a box of cereal, it's these same vitamins. So we talk about the obesity epidemic, and I think one of the things that has so empowered it is the fact that we've created the rocket fuel, that we've taken these empty carbs and put in the B vitamins that are necessary to to process, to metabolize those carbs. So here's what's really interesting about the pellagra diet. It was not this starvation diet of people, starving. It was actually an incredibly calorie-rich diet. What did the poor Southerners eat? They ate grits, which is cornmeal, with molasses and pork fat. Carbs, sugar, and fat. They had calories galore, and yet they were starving. Why? Because a calorie, we think of calories like energy in the wall. Calories are pure energy. They're not. Without the necessary micronutrients, the body can't metabolize those calories. And so I think one of the things that makes Italians skinny is the fact that they're not getting their B vitamins in their flour, that they have to get it in their leafy greens, for example. And then when you eat leafy greens, it takes up stomach capacity. It means you're not eating something calorie dense. And they love those foods. They actually have a whole party in Veneto. They love these members of the chicory family that are so bitter. They have street parties. They love it. So you say it's culture. It is culture. But I think there's something even more elemental that comes down to nutrition and the relationship with the food that enters your body and how that food is made, how it's grown and how it's made and how it's altered or not altered.
So, just to be clear.
Oh, radicchio, by the way, it's radicchio.
Radicchio, yeah, right. So when we talk about when the motivation for enriching this rocket fuel for the livestock was that they would grow fast, they would put on weight fast.
Yeah, right? and you can look at the exactly, and the pigs we eat now are bigger but much younger than the pork we ate 50, 60
It would not make them healthier.
I wouldn't say so, no.
No. And they don't last so long, but they grow very quickly. So when we're doing the same thing to our own food, not to mention we're eating those animals,
yes,
which are not the same meat as animals fed very differently, and we're enriching the food that we're getting that are not animals with the same kind of rocket fuel, it kind of sounds like we're creating CAFOs for ourselves.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it.
And so we created Wonder Bread, which is really the symbol of this. This was done with government participation. And they fortified the bread, and then they made it a selling point. Builds healthy bodies. It was first 8 ways, now I think it's 12 ways. Maybe it's gone higher since then. So basically, it's brilliant business. It allows you to sell the problem and the solution in one neat package. But it's only as good a fix as our understanding of nutrition is. And this is where the work of the man to my left was really central to my understanding. David has done work on food synergy. And one of his, I think, amazing findings, and he'll tell you more about it, is that first of all, we know that people who eat lots of whole grain generally are healthier and have less chronic diseases and better mortality, a better lifespan than other people. We know it has something to do with the nutrients that we took out of whole grain. But here's the amazing thing. Even people who get all those nutrients from other sources, I'm talking about the vitamins and the fiber and the oils that are in whole grain, don't do as well as people who just eat whole grain. It strongly suggests that breaking foods down into their parts and reassembling them doesn't necessarily work. And there could be 2 possible explanations for that. One is we haven't identified all the stuff we've taken out of it. We can only put back what we can measure and return. And the other is, as he suggests, that there is some synergy between those nutrients and the structure of the food, which we never talk about. We just talk about these building blocks. The more I learned about the importance of whole grain, and there was another context in which I was learning about it, which I was learning a lot about the gut, which Bob alluded to, and Mark can talk to us about in greater detail. But we are learning that our health is not just connected to the foods that we eat in the sense of our bodies, but we share our bodies with a vast number of other species of microbes, mostly bacteria, and that unless they're well fed as well, we're not going to be healthy. And so all our nutrition science has been built on really feeding our bodies, which really represents only about 10% of the story by species. and 1% by numbers of cells. And so that unless you take account of the interests of the microbiome, and these are mostly the microbes occupying your large intestine, you are not going to be completely healthy. And this brings up the importance of fiber, something that you take out of whole grain to make white bread. And we knew fiber was important, and we had epidemiology suggesting fiber was important, and people thought it had to do with things like bulk and transit time through the digestive system. But lo and behold, the real importance of fiber turns out to be, according to our current knowledge, that it's the favorite food of the microbes in your gut, and that they need fiber as a food source. And without it, they don't do very well, and then we don't do very well. So the complexity of whole grain is such that it's very interesting to do the reductive science and try to get to the bottom of it, but the important thing to keep your eye on is we know it's important. And so I went looking for my second quest, which was to build a great whole grain loaf, much, much harder. So the question is, why was it so much harder? Why not just substitute white flour for whole grain flour? There's whole grain flour everywhere. You can buy it, General Mills will sell it to you. But if you simply substitute it in a recipe, it doesn't work for a lot of very interesting reasons.
Yeah, when we were talking earlier, I was struck, you were saying, well, whole wheat, by and large, is almost not ever whole wheat.
Yeah, national brand pastas, including Barilla, and that say 100% whole grain in the label. They have the whole grain council 100%. And they're testing it at 10.7% protein. 10.7% germ. So the amount of germ that you would expect.
There was a tenth of the expected amount if it were whole.
Yeah, so if you follow the USDA or Mayo Clinic and Harvard, they also have 3 or 4 portions a day of whole grain. Well, if you're using pasta, you need 40 portions a day to get that value. And the flours were, in the 60 to 7% range. Famous national brand flours. So it's published with the labels. You can find the complete test on the Community Grains website. And then the question is like, well, this is a big mountain. This is like really important. We know that whole grains are really important. Everybody concedes. There's, dozens of studies that present positive outcomes for age-related diseases with whole grain consumption. Diabetes, cancers,
heart disease,
dementia. Yeah, and we're not getting it.
We're not getting it.
And I gave a talk at Culinary Institute America in Hyde Park. There's a big audience, and afterwards, and I mentioned the study, and I said national brands, we tested national brands, and it was disappointing. And so, I shouldn't say who, but so the president of an important pasta company came up to me. His name was Bob. He said, "So how do we do?" And I said, "Well, you could improve." He probably doesn't know the protein, the germ content in his wheat. Yeah. He probably doesn't know. He probably would like it to be 100%.
And what this says to me is that not only are people not getting whole food, real food, which we know it has huge benefits, but it's literally not available for them. Is that right? Did I get that?
So the test, obviously ours is 100% whole grain. Bob's Red Mill tested at 100%. King Arthur did not, far from it. Gold medal. And it's just this whole idea about the value of food being calories or sugar or taste or, charming looking farmers, dogs, children, as opposed to nutrient value. is a big part of the problem. And so, to go back to that industry guy who says, "Oh, but look, little boy, you don't understand. You're just kind of, in the stars, thinking that you're going to feed the world with that food." Well, they're not feeding the world. They're not giving them anything that they can use, that real nutrition. Calories does not cut it.
Right.
Anecdotally, I've never seen the study or anything like that, but you put a bunch of white flour and feed rats white flours, they die. White flour. And you feed them whole grain and they can do okay.
So in order for people to be healthy and to feel good, they need to be fed nutritious food.
Yeah.
And in order to do that...
Do you think that's shocking?
Well, I guess it is shocking. In order to do that, we have to change the food system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And by the way, if you want to change your diet and increase your healthfulness and opt out of the big food chain, I would say that's the number one place to go. Bake your own bread and take control of your own milling. A farmer once told me that he said the first thing Hitler did when he came to power in 1933, and he started a long list of laws. The first one for Jews, they took away the power to mill. They could not own a mill. Could not own a mill in their town or in their region. Mills were closed, and because they knew, or he knew, or somebody knew, that is real power. And you take that away first, and you become dependent on the state, and you lose control. Taking back control is not just growing your own food, although, hell, that's a great first step. But grains are what feed us. And in our culture, taking control of wheat is the change agent. So people always ask me, what's one thing I could do? It's like bake bread. Because you can live on it, and you can do very well on it. Very powerful, very powerful.
I mean, we've all had these loaves, these brick-like hippie loaves that were very common in the late '60s and early '70s. And by and large, those loaves sucked because they were substituting not very good whole grain flour for white flour. And a couple things happen. One is, and we'll learn this from Stephen Jones a little later, we have not been breeding wheat for the purposes of making whole grain flour. We've been breeding it to make white flour, to have the biggest, starchiest endosperm and highest protein level in the endosperm possible. And so when you're selecting, you can't select for everything at once. And so if you select for that, you kind of ignore the quality of the bran and the germ and the flavor of those things. So over time, bran got harder because that made it easier to mill when you're making white flour, and bran got more bitter. So it didn't taste as good as it once did, and as it still could if you kept that in view. And there are breeders here working on that very question. Then there's the issue of commercial yeast. Commercial yeast is adapted to a white flour system. And so you really, if you don't have a sourdough starter and you just kind of use your same recipe and use yeast on whole grain flour, you're going to have the phenomenon that you've all noticed with those hippie loaves, which is it crumbles in your toaster. It doesn't have any kind of integrity as a loaf of bread because the wheat hasn't been properly conditioned by a sourdough starter. So there's another change you have to take account of. The recipes themselves, too. Whole grain is much more temperamental. It's much more active. It has a lot more food for the microbes. So sometimes your fermentation speeds up and goes crazy. So there are many, many things that have to change. And I realize that we're making whole grain bread in what I call a white flour industrial complex, and that is impossible to do well. That you need different kinds of wheat, you need different kinds of baking, you need a different microbial culture, and you need a different human culture to make it really well. And so I went looking for that. And I had a moment of despair along the way when I was turning out one lousy loaf after another, and I realized, I don't just need new flour, I need a whole new civilization to do this right, which is setting the bar kind of high.
we can't talk about food independent of health, because food and health go together like a hand in glove. And if you look at the amount that we spend in this country for food plus health, for the last 60 years hasn't really changed much. But what has changed is the ratio of what you're spending for food and health. It used to be we spent 7 and 8, 9% for health and about 18, 19% for food. Now that's just reversed. So the health is sky high because so many people are sick, for one thing. Of course, and health things cost more. But now 60% of this country has at least one chronic disease. 40% have 2 or more. You know, no country can sustain that, and it's getting worse and worse year by year. And it doesn't matter what kind of healthcare program you have. There's a lot of debate about that nowadays. It doesn't matter what kind of healthcare you have if a significant percent of the people are ill. You're going to break the country, you're going to break the system. Eventually it will come down because no society can pay for that much sickness.
I'm talking today with my friend Bob Quinn. Bob, welcome. Welcome to my farm.
It's great to be here. It's a gorgeous day and first time I've been here, so it's been a real treat.
Yeah. So, do you believe that the wheat that you grow on your farm now, that the organic wheat grown under that system is nutritionally superior?
Well, I do. But let me qualify that a little bit. I didn't really, as I mentioned just earlier a little bit, I didn't really get into the nutritional aspect of this immediately. With wheat, there was no research about that, for one thing. We ran into a period in the 90s where wheat started to become, you know, the bad boy in the block. And everybody was going wheat-free and gluten-free because of nearly 20% of the people in this country could no longer eat what we call modern wheat without difficulty. And we had an ancient grain that I had first seen when I was a kid at county fair. And my father was quite enamored with this because a friend of his had actually brought this back from Portugal and sent it to a friend of his in our county. And it grown, and it's supposed to come out of a tomb in Egypt. Well, it grew, and so that should have been the first clue it wasn't 4,000 years old coming out of tombs, right? Because seeds don't really last that long. It doesn't matter if they're in a tomb or not.
They last a long time, but not 4,000 years.
No, not 4,000 years, not 4,000. And so anyway, it was a novelty. It was a giant wheat. I always take some of my hat now. It was a giant wheat that the kernels were about 2 or 3 times bigger than the normal wheat. We took it to this food show, and out of all these hundreds of people that came by, my dad had a little jar. He was showing it to everybody, and one person said, "This is just what I'm looking for." And because of that one person, we went home. We had 50 pounds or so in storage by then, because we had another guy was interested many years before, but then they lost interest before we had enough to give it to them or give for their product. So because that one person, we planted all 50 pounds in a half acre. And then, to make a really long story really short, within about 30 years, we were up to 100,000 acres of this stuff. It scattered around 250 organic farms in Montana, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. Most of it being sold into Italy, 75%, where they make over 3,000 different products. It's just amazing how it's taken off. But in the very beginning, we thought of it as a novelty, something that would be unusual, and if somebody wanted something where it could be another crop in our rotation. Well, I had a friend in California. He said, "Well, I've got an idea for this," and he took it to a pasta manufacturer, and they made pasta, and it made a wonderful whole wheat pasta that was had a very nice smooth texture. Whole wheat pasta in those days was just ground up modern durum, and it was very gritty and scratched the back of your throat. This didn't do that. It was very soft. Had a soft brand, we found out later, and it was a soft, nice texture. Well, my dad gave a package of this to a lady who lived in a nearby town who had such terrible food allergies that she couldn't eat wheat or many other things, and they were completely debilitated her. And I said to my dad, so this is about 89 now or so, and I said, "Well, Dad, why did you give her that pasta? You know she can't eat wheat. It's going to make her sick." He said, well, he says it's organic, isn't it? So here my dad is now. He's more converted than I am, you see. So anyway, this lady called back the next day and she said, what is this stuff? She said, when I ate it, and she did a little kinesiology and muscle testing to make sure it wouldn't make her terrible ill. And she thought she could try it, so she ate it. She said, but when I ate it, it made me feel better. I said, wow, never heard of that before. Well, we'll give you some more. And then she said, and a few days later, she said, you know, I have a sister, and she has all kinds of food allergies, and she can't eat wheat either. Could we send her some? And I said, sure, we'll send her a whole box. We sent her a whole carton full of these little sample bags. She called us back in 2 or 3 weeks, and she said, after she had eaten this, maybe nearly a month, she said not only could she eat it and it made her feel better, but she became less sensitive to other foods that she was having trouble with. And when I heard that, I said, oh, wow, this isn't just a novelty. This is like, you know, a gift from the Lord or something to help people feel better, to heal.
This is medicine.
And this is medicine. And then my scientific juices started running again. I said, we need to understand what's going on with this. I couldn't find anybody in America hardly in the early 90s that believed, first of all, that took seriously the food or the wheat allergy or sensitivity idea. Most of them said, well, it's in their heads, you know, that they just believe it's not good for them, and so it's a fad. But in Italy, I found a group in University of Bologna and University of Florence that really did want to look at it. Because in Italy, if you can't eat your pasta, I mean, you just don't run down the street and buy wheat-free, gluten-free. First of all, it doesn't exist. But you want to eat your pasta, and you want to know why you can't. And so they were very interested in this. Yeah. And they started doing research, and it cost us a lot of money. But we ended up with 35 peer-reviewed journal articles that were published in high-class, highly reputable journals, mostly in Europe and US journals, that clearly identified the differences between modern wheat and ancient wheat and how it affected the body. And in the last dozen or so papers have dealt with chronic disease. And so we did human clinical trials. We don't know how this worked. We don't know the mode of action, but we know when people eat modern wheat or eat ancient wheat in a double-blind crossover study. So one group would eat one, then another group, and the other group ate the other. Then they cross over after having a washout period for 6 or 8 weeks, so that nobody knew what they were eating. And so they were both told it was going to be good for them because they didn't want them to think negatively. But we started studying heart disease, diabetes, irritable bowel syndrome, non-alcoholic fatty liver syndrome, fibromyalgia. Those are the main ones that we published on. These are all major diseases that affect mankind throughout the whole world. And we found there was a tremendous difference in how wheat had an effect on these diseases. What we found that modern wheat in every case was inflammatory at some level, and this ancient wheat was anti-inflammatory. And the difference was like 35 to 45%. It was huge. Medicine, pills couldn't mimic that. And the researchers were just astounded. They'd never seen anything like this before. And it really started to bring into my whole understanding of teaching of Hippocrates 2,300 years ago that food should be your medicine and medicine should be your food. And it was right in front of me, the very epitome of that. And to think that wheat is a food which was a staple for ancient civilizations of particularly the Western world, the Romans, the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Ethiopians, the Phoenicians, all these great civilizations that existed in even parts of China, in India. And yet today it's forbidden for 20% of the people to eat it. So what's happened? And a lot of people say, well, don't eat wheat at all. That's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We need to understand what we've done with modern wheat, with the breeding program, which is so focused on yields, that we have so diminished nutrition and brought other problems into effect that now 20% of the people have trouble eating it. So it does make a difference of what seed we put in the ground. So the soil is very, very important. It's the heart. But what we put through that heart, the blood that goes pumped through that heart, really makes a difference if it's good blood or bad blood. And the bad blood, in many cases, is a result of the loss of nutrition by focusing on too much on just one external or industrial component, and that is either manufacturing components to make it easier or more profitable to manufacture, or higher yields. And that's what we've done with wheat.
What we're looking at here, and when you talk to Eli, I think the frame that to me is most interesting is this is actually SpaceX stuff. This is futuristic. This is not what your great-grandparents did. It's what nobody's done. And we're charting a new course. And to do that, you need to reverse engineer starting with seed, because seed has been so corrupted with wheat to satisfy white flour, which is 99.999% of the market. So I think it's interesting. And so if there's a differential here, I don't think at Kraft, you're right, Eli and the team are amazing, but they've been amazing bakers here for 20 years. The quality of the wheats that we're going, and by the way, you can have good quality, soft bran wheats, but grow them inorganically and you don't get the kind of flavors that you get. I mean, the expression of wheat through the right kind of soil is astounding. You know, when I was researching the third plate, I remember reading about old French farmers. They talked about this variety, Renan, and other varieties that would smell like cinnamon. And they said it's a reward for well-nutrified soil. Basically soils where they didn't have nutrients. It was just your soil was well cared for and you got rewarded with cinnamon. And the other day, this incredible farmer from Maryland who's nails it, gave us Renan, this old French variety. And Eli comes running in the kitchen. I hadn't thought of that cinnamon wheat since 2008, and that's when I read it, so almost 20 years ago. And he comes in the kitchen, he breaks open this thing. And Dave, I swear to God, it was cinnamon bread, like cinnamon toast crunch, but real. And it was astounding. And I said, I couldn't believe it. I was like, this is it. This is what they were talking about. So he said the wheat's gone bad. That was so interesting. There's a lot of the goes, oh, this is gone, you know, it's corrupted or whatever. And I was like, no, God, guys, what you have in your hand is a gift. And what we need to do is bake this and celebrate in the dining room and talk about it. Open it up, let people smell the cinnamon and explain the context, because it's the reward for this guy's soil amendments and rotation and everything he's doing right. It's right here in the flavor. Yeah. Oh, gave me chills. Yeah, it still gives me chills talking about it.
Yeah.
But you know, we have lost the taste of wheat, and we need to get it back. And that has to be done in a local context. You know, right now we're in Terrytown. That's Tear Town. Tear is Wheat Town. This was Wheat Town.
Yeah.
Probably 10,000 varieties up and down the East Coast here.
Amazing.
That are all gone.
All gone.
So we need to bring that back, and we need to bring it back with intention. It's not just to grow wheat locally, which is a good intention. It's or any grain. It's to grow it for the right purpose, which is flavor and nutrition, and that requires a certain kind of genetics and a certain kind of soil. It's all of them coming together. Now you know why wheat built civilizations. You know, everything I just talked about takes a community to do it. It's to me, it really is the organic ideal. It's everything is connected. The seed, the soil, the community, the baker, the mill. You can't, you know. There's a tomato. We could go out, pick a tomato and eat it right now. You don't need anyone. You don't need a community. You need ourselves. It doesn't build community. Community is built through wheat in the Western, corn in the global South, rice in the East. I mean, those require cooperation and community to make it happen. And to me, you're right. I'm glad I answered that. The most powerful thing could be wheat, and it could be the most democratizable, which is the most exciting part of it. Yeah.
All right.
I got to get you a loaf.
Thank you for listening to the Real Organic Podcast. We'd like to express our gratitude to Bob Klein and Community Grains for allowing us to use the footage of our friend Michael Pollan. Please join us next week when we continue this important conversation about real organic grain with Eli Pitkin, the baker from Blue Hill at Stone Barns. Eli walks Dave through basics of making a loaf of homemade bread from scratch and why it matters. So if you're feeling inspired to make your own bread after listening today, you'll want to be sure to catch our next episode. Our movement is growing because you are subscribing and sharing these podcasts with your friends. So keep it up and leave us a rating and review as well. You can find a video version of this interview at realorganicproject.org or on our YouTube channel. Remember to join us every Sunday for a new episode featuring voices from the organic movement. So see you next time.